This is Human Environment Geography. I am Hannah Gress, and I will be discussing the research tradition of human environment geography. What is it? It is a branch of geography that describes and explains the spatial aspects of interactions between human individuals or societies and their natural environment. It studies humans and nature and how we interact. It is a combination of physical geography and human geography. The relationship between humans and the environment can sometimes become obscured, especially with technology. With human environment geography, we measure the result of human activity on natural landforms and cycles. To aid in getting a better understanding of human environment geography, I'll be using After 1492, Nature Rebounds by Denovan. The beginning of this article has a quote I quite like. Nature's regeneration was the primary source of the Pristine Myth. And of course you may be wondering, what is the Pristine Myth? Well, the Pristine Myth was coined by Denovan. It was a heated debate about the degree to which the environment was or was not altered by the pre-European native people. And it was believed that the Americas in 1491 were almost untouched land, untrammeled by man, and it was completely false. And rebounding is the reason why everyone thought Pristine Myth was true. It's because after the depopulation, nature rebounded, which is a recovery towards a prior condition. Now, this doesn't mean that it's a full return to what it was before. Many times the forest is very different in both dramatic and subtle ways, and sometimes the secondary forest contains greater biodiversity and more economic plants than the previous primary forest, and that really depends on the alteration of the land done by humans before depopulation. Well, of course, what happened? The depopulation of the area of the native people. See what the foreign diseases decimated the population, and we can getting into why the population was decimated and the causes and all the details. It can be a whole different presentation. So we're just gonna stick with foreign diseases decimated the population, and the effects of that were population societies collapsed, of course. But this meant farms were abandoned, hunting and burning were reduced, which caused the forest and wildlife to return. And this continued into the 19th century, and then it was reversed because, European settlement. So the reading is divided into three main sections. And this first section is called A World Without People. And it's all about how humans are just fascinated by narratives that describe human disaster or nature returns in times, like a post-apocalyptic type of world. And there are a lot of fictitious books and writings and all kinds of stuff that have stuff like this, and it describes it. And one he really gets into is a novel called Earth Abides, and it's about how this guy named Ish is the last American, and how he was doing field work and he was bitten by a rattlesnake, and he goes to recover, and then when he comes home after his recovery, he finds that most people there and basically worldwide have died of a virus, and his rattlesnake bite made him immune. And he's one of these few people that are surviving in this post-apocalyptic world. Well, he's not able to really educate people. I mean, he's an educated man. He would have worked at a university. It says somewhere that he would have worked at like Oakland or Columbia or something like that. But he's just not able to relay that information to the group's children and grandchildren. So because they're mainly interested in survival. They need basic survival skills. They don't have time to learn how to read and write. They have to go get food and water and shelter and clothing. And it goes on, and he just becomes like the last educated man. And he's this old man dying, and the world is just completely different than what he grew up in. And it's really a good example of what happened in the Western Hemisphere. And luckily, there is a partial historical record of what happened in the Western Hemisphere, because most of these accounts are partial or fictitious. And what really happened was approximately 85% of the native population died. And in some regions, it was a total decimation, 100%. And that allowed for the forest to recover and wildlife to bounce back from being hunted. And this moves on to the next section, called the return of forests. Now, within the Western Hemisphere, while there are good accounts of what happened, or partial accounts of what happened, it's not uniform. There's different regions and different things happen in different regions, though there are a lot of similarities. So one region that this was discussed was Eastern North America, and it in the 16th to 17th century was well populated by the native populations. But when the travelers and European travelers and settlers got there, they reported dense forests nearly empty of people. But they weren't empty before. It's because the epidemics came and they decimated the population and allowed the forest to return. There's a good quote in there that I've included here that says, "Almost wherever the European went, destroying the Indians, forests followed. The great American forest may be more a product of European settlement than a victim of it." And he moves on to discuss the other regions. For California, the California Indian population, they lacked cultivation, didn't really clear the forests, but they did forage for useful plants and wildlife, and that affected the vegetation patterns. They also burned frequently, which extended the grasslands. In Latin America, there was lowland forest resurgence following early colonial depopulation, documented for Panama and Western Colombia. And soon after this depopulation, much of savannas in Panama reverted to forests. There was actually a recent pollen study for Central America, specifically coastal El Salvador, which was the most densely populated and deforested sector of Central America in 1492, as well as today. And this pollen study indicated two periods of forest return. The first was following a great volcanic eruption in 430 AD, and the second, of course, followed the European arrival in the 16th century. And this demonstrated that deforestation and forest return was not necessarily linear. And areas that maintained their population did not experience the reforestation patterns that the other areas had. However, even small populations had huge impacts on the environment. This goes on to the next section, which is wildlife eruptions. And there's a general observation of the 18th and 19th century recorded massive amounts of wildlife by the explorers and travelers. And a lot thought these numbers were natural, that they were supposed to be here, but that was just part of the Pristine Myth. And with depopulation and reduced hunting pressure, the numbers of species exploded along with their predators. And a good example of this is the bison. The bison was the native population's most important resource. They served for food, clothing, blankets, tools, dwellings, utensils, rope and thread, shields, and weapons. They were killed with bows and arrows and with spears, and they were driven by fire into long funnel-shaped corrals into rivers or off of cliffs. And sadly, overkill was common, and that was there's evidence of that in large bone piles that still actually exist. When the depopulation happened, the bison population rose rapidly on the rich prairie grasslands, and their population rose faster than the carnivores could control them. And in time, a balance of sorts would have been reached, but repopulation happened, and the population of the bison also went down again. They were almost wiped out in the mid to late 19th century. Another good documentation of the wildlife eruptions was Meriwether Lewis and William Clark in 1805 and 1806. They went east of the Rockies, where the Indian populations had been depleted, and they saw that buffalo and elk were plentiful and that there was a lot of game. But when they went to the west of the Columbia River and the plateau regions, where the Indian population was still numerous, the game was scarce. A quote is, "Nothing to eat but dried roots and dried fish." Their large game animals were depleted, and actually their bones are rarely encountered in late pre-European archaeological sites in the Rocky Mountains. And of course, after the depopulation, there were a lot of different species that exploded. Another species is the pigeon, the passenger pigeon, and that explosion apparently resulted from the declining Indian population numbers, but also due to the increase of food sources previously consumed by both the game animals and the native population. However, not all Native American populations overkilled, like with the bison. Some Native American hunters allowed for recovery, and they rested their hunting zones intentionally, and they did habitat modification with fire. In Latin America, in pre-1492, the Indian population was catastrophic on wildlife. And in fact, most wild animals became rare or locally extinct. And when the Spanish settlers arrived, they saw that the population was in a state of semi-starvation and ate any living thing that they could catch. So you can see that the cultivation and reliance on the land wasn't really strong in this specific native population, but that doesn't mean it wasn't strong in other populations. And he moves on. His last section is all about the California wildlife, and California is kind of unique on the North America because I'm going to get into that next slide. Okay, so the Spanish mission was there from 1796 to 1848, and in the 1830s and 1840s there were numerous accounts of great numbers of large game, and this abundance of wildlife was assumed to be prehistoric. And the Spanish mission, since they arrived, they saw a steady decline of the native population from 310,000 in 1769 to only 30,000 by 1870. And that is an indication that native population corresponds with and causes the waxing and waning of wildlife population, because the wildlife numbers recovered rapidly and were a major food in the early Spanish missions and settlements. So, there has been a steady reduction of bones, a favored food species, for over 700 years. And the analysis of skeletons show progressive nutritional stress as well as indications of increasing interpersonal violence. And this shows an increasing competition for declining resources. The native populations of the area did not cultivate domesticated crops. They relied very heavily on wild game. And at the time, it was believed that game populations were maintained by conservation management, but that was completely false. Pre-1492 populations were in a state of decline because of game overkill, including local extinctions. And this is very unique to the California area, and other native populations on North America were productive farmers, including the Plains tribes. Their crops would replace depleted game and fish. However, the Plains tribes, after depopulation from disease and the resulting explosion of buffalo and antelope numbers, and with the acquisition of horses, became more dependent on game and less dependent on cultivation, and even abandoned cultivation altogether. At the end of Nature Abounds, there's Donovan really ends on this quote here. It says, "Earth abides, nature proceeds, whether we are present or not. However, where we have been, our mark may long persist, but may not be obvious." And Nature Abounds is a really good analysis, a really good example to use for human environment geography, because it really analyzes how humans interacted with the landscape and how they modified it, and how the lack of human presence allowed the landscape to really just reclaim what humans decided to put their footprint on. So this has been my human environment geography presentation. I wasn't sure if I should put this reference in the back, but this is the article I used. Yeah, it's a very good article. If you're interested in the subject, I highly recommend it. And thanks for listening.